Hello, and welcome to The Confident Commit, the podcast for anyone who wants to join the conversation on delivering software better and faster.
If you're looking to build a trusted ship, tune in, let's confidently commit.
You're listening to episode 13. Today, I'm joined by Deepak G. I'm going to call him that, but Deepak, I'm doing that because I know I'm going to absolutely destroy your last name. So why don't you help us all?
It's totally fine. It's Giridharagopal. So it's like proud Indian tradition. It's three words smashed together into one extremely long word with what I assume is a really high Scrabble score. So
wait, is it legal? Is it legal in Scrabble?
Scrabble, it depends on if you're playing in international waters, and then anything is legal. So
I like that. I'm always going to play in international waters.
There you go.
So I love it. We're learning already. I'm Rob Zuber, your host, CTO of CircleCI, the industry leader for all things CI and CD. Deepak, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm really excited about this.
Absolutely. This is awesome. And I know we're on video, so because everybody, I'm sure that's listening and watching this wants to see the faces behind the technology, because we're so handsome.
Oh, I thought you were actually going to give us an intro to the artwork on your walls, but maybe we'll save that for later. Because I assume that's what happened. People look and they say, oh, tell me a little bit more about this person. Like, what can I see in the background? What can I learn? And probably anyone that's listening right now is like, wait, maybe I'll watch the video. What is in the background?
There you go. I love it.
Anyway, awesome. Well, thanks for joining me. And, I think I would assume, although maybe that's bold, that many, many people who are listening to this will know a lot about Puppet. But you've been there a really long time. And have been through some, I would say, both transitions in terms of like the growth of the organization, and then more recently some personal, just in terms of your approach. So give us a little bit of that background. When did you start? What was the company like? And what problem were you trying to solve?
Yeah, I think I've been at Puppet for a little over 10 years, which is like, when I think about the average tenure of someone at a company, and it's like sub 2 years, I think at this point.
Yeah, I think that's about right. Yeah.
So 10 years is like outrageous by comparison. But it has its benefits, right? Like one major thing is over all the different phases of the company. If you've been around long enough, like I've been able to see, this is both good and bad, but every single decision that I have made over the past, decade, I've seen them play out in many cases, like to their absolute conclusion. Mm-hmm. So from a learning standpoint, that's actually really interesting because you don't, a lot of times we make these decisions, architectural decisions, business decisions, roadmap decisions, but sometimes you leave before you really see what how the movie ends, right? In a lot of cases. Right. So that's been educational for me. But yeah, 10 years ago, I think when I started at Puppet, so that's circa 2011. So that, I guess, to benchmark it, is really early in the DevOps universe. I thought it was sort of like still a new and emergent thing, like coming out of Western Europe, I think, at the time.
Yeah.
So I was really involved with that community, which is how I got involved with Puppet. And I knew the founder, Luke, behind Puppet. So when I joined, the company was really small. And, the problems that we were trying to, it's an open source project, right? Like Puppet, for those who aren't familiar, like, it's a really popular open source project that does like systems automation, configuration management, like server orchestration. Most of it is open source, all the core engine is out there. So that was the environment that I joined the company in, which is we had this really, at the time, emerging open source project. It was, I'll say, popular amongst a certain niche audience that was really into the things I just mentioned, which hilariously now probably everyone is into. Like if you do, say, back-end development at any software company now, you probably care to some degree about the infrastructure your stuff gets deployed on.
Yep.
But that was absolutely not the case back then. So that was very much, hey, we're an open source software companies that were commercial companies. We're still not a super commonplace thing. Like you had maybe Red Hat and a number of other, like the second wave of them. And I would say we were amongst that group. So a lot of the problems there were around helping people, it's super basic stuff. Like I have zillions of machines. How do I make them all look the same way? That's higher leverage. How do I automate them by like doing a thing over here, and then doing it at scale and doing that in parallel? Which again, like now I think you can look back and be like, really, was that an issue? But it's like, that was a huge issue because no one recognized the magnitude of that problem. This was pre-SRE. This was pre-DevOps in many cases. So it's almost like a sysadmin systems engineering kind of crowd. So the biggest issues then was honestly, a lot of it was convincing people that automation was a good idea. Right. And I'm very happy to report
that report from the future.
Yeah. It's like, turns out that we were right. That's the least controversial statement ever. Like, yeah, that was right. People kind of get that now, but that was a really big deal. So back then it was a lot of, how do we commercially differentiate, our products from the open source stuff? How do we keep the open source community happy? How do we turn this into a business and grow it? How do we take a small group of more open source centric kind of hackers working on this stuff and then turn it into like commercial product delivery, which is like a very different tone, for everything, sales, all kinds of stuff. And then, over the years, it's been kind of gratifying to see the business grow and succeed. And every couple of years, every inflection point in growth, it's almost like a different job. Right. Yeah. Where what it means to be a CTO, like at a super tiny company, it's less than 20 people. And then what it means to be CTO now is, you're still playing the same game, but it's so much different. The span is different. The scope is different. Leverage is different. What people ask you to do is different. But it's been a good ride. And I think now we kind of find ourselves on the other side of that automation chasm, right? Where people get it now. They like it. Yeah. Now the biggest issue is, especially when you get into bigger enterprises, it's like, how do they absorb all this stuff? Like, they know they want to automate more stuff with their infrastructure. They want to move more quickly. They have good reasons to do all this, but their absorption capacity for new tools or skills necessary to do this does not keep pace with like the complexity and the scale of the infra. So I find myself now spending a lot of time trying to build products that really fit well within that enterprise environment because, well, they have the biggest needs. And frankly, that's the biggest market opportunity I think that we have in front of us. So.
Right. Well, that's really interesting. I mean, first of all, I think I can reflect a little bit. I've been at CircleCI since we were 14 people, I think, and now we're a little over 650. So certainly my role has shifted regularly throughout that time frame. And also, you're in a space that has shifted significantly and your customer base is shifting, right? So all of that I think is really interesting. Like CircleCI, I wasn't here at CircleCI, but was founded in 2011. So I know that time period very well, right? And I would say when we talk about some of the early successes of CircleCI, it was that so much shift was happening and there was an opportunity to step in and really participate in that. And so I guess over that time, and then you could talk a little bit more about it, but more recently you've shifted more into new product introduction, new product development, like really looking at how do I innovate inside of this larger organization. So you're kind of a little bit back to the roots, but at the same time, the market has changed and you're talking about a different customer. So how do you bring some of that in, but also adapt to that shifted context?
Yeah, that's a super good question. And I think I get the impression that there's a bunch of different playbooks out there from people that have done the startup-y thing, but some of that stuff breaks down if you're trying to do it within the auspices of a larger pre-existing company, especially one that has an existing product line, at a certain level of maturity. Like, you don't want to disrupt that. But at the same time, you kind of do want to disrupt yourself because, well, if you don't disrupt yourself, someone else probably will, right? So better to be the one in charge, better to be behind the steering wheel, I think, of that journey, right? Than just have somebody blindside you. So I think in terms of the overall dynamics of the industry, the way I see it, and I'd actually be super curious to see if there's parallels to this in kind of the software delivery space, like the part that Circle plays in. But I think the way that I've seen stuff play out is in a couple of different ways. I think there's absolutely been radical shifts in the underlying technology, right? Like I think the kind of stuff that people have available to them to build new systems, like I'm a systems builder by trade, by my background. So like, it's like the best time ever to be a systems builder because you have so much choice and so many different options are available, like via credit card swipe, and I could build the most complex thing, the most scaled out-ish thing that I want to in like days. Now there's a separate question, which is like, is that good? Is that a responsible use of all that kind of power? But that's a different podcast that I could complain about. Our industry's obsession with maybe too much scale relative to the problems that most companies have. But I think there's definitely been kind of sea changes in the technology itself, where increasingly the underlying infrastructure is presented to users at a higher level of abstraction than ever before, which means that it's a different surface area if you want to automate stuff. So for a lot of companies, it's less about, on these types of systems, it's less about like flipping bits and files on disk. And it might be more interacting with an API for your container orchestrator or your IaaS in the cloud, spinning up an EC2 node or whatever it is. So in that universe, I think we went through this phase where people felt, oh, this higher level of abstraction for infrastructure means that, I don't have to care so much about how this stuff gets configured, how it links together, because, well, these things are so high powered, right? In terms of abstraction, that it's practically self-assembling, which of course, like having lived through multiple different upending of like technologies, I'm like, nothing ever really manages itself. It's more the surface area changes. What you need to configure and what you need to wrap your brain around in terms of complexity, it's different. It's more API centric than it is, I think, file centric or what's inside the box. Because it's easy to just freeze a box and then bring it up whenever you want and make me 28 copies of it. And you could do that super quickly on any cloud there is. So I think there's a new frontier that exists on a technology level where an operation, like a lot of ops teams that I talk to now, the biggest problems they have in terms of like ops 101 kind of stuff, like say incident response, is like, look, if an incident happens, what's the process I have to go through to deal with it? And that's everything from how do I receive the input from whatever monitoring system I've got to like, okay, something is wrong. I need to go to like 6 different systems, collect forensic info. I got to like notify my team on Slack. If I'm at a big megacorp, maybe I have to update a ticket in ServiceNow or in Jira or something like that. I have to do all this stuff. And just what I mentioned right there talks to like 5 different vendors with like completely different APIs. But fundamentally, I look at it and I'm like, it's still an automation problem. In many ways, you're trying to codify like a policy, which is how do I want to respond when things like this happen? But it's just so tough because it's unreasonable to ask a team to become experts in all this stuff. So I think there's an emerging frontier where there's an opportunity to create abstractions that simplify interactions with the new set of tools that ops people consider part of their remit. Right. And Slack is just as important as their CI, I think, to a lot of teams. So why aren't we treating that with the same degree of automation, kind of care and concern that we would any of the more gearhead centric tools that we have? Because it's all important. And lack of coverage there makes it hard to get anything done. So, I don't know if you see a similar thing play out in your universe, but.
Well, absolutely. I think You said it was a different podcast where we're going to talk about people, investing in too much scale.
We can go there now if you want.
That is the heart of this podcast. Like when I think about, we try to center around delivering effectively, right? And what does that mean to people? And you're absolutely right. Like we're good at naming the tools that we all agree are part of the software delivery pipeline. And of course, we're really excited to be part of that. But at the same time, to your point, like if Slack is down, how much software gets delivered? Yeah. Right. On the one hand, I would think a lot because people aren't talking to each other. But on the other, no one knows how to get anything done without it anymore. Right.
So I want to say it was earlier this year. I think I think a bunch of people came back from the holidays in the US and then like Slack was down that first week when everyone was back. And you're totally right. It work ground to a halt as similarly as if there was an AWS outage or our CI system isn't working or something. Like it's the same deal.
It's fascinating to become dependent on something without like as an implicit, I'll call it an implicit decision. Like no one made an active decision that all of our systems, like all of our work will depend on this. Yeah. But most people don't really have a resilience plan, right? Like we ostensibly shift to IRC, but I think there's about 15 people in the company that know how to use IRC. So it's not that strong.
They're just like, you may as well have put a ham radio in front of probably some of the folks. Like,
that's right. Turn this crank.
Yeah.
right? And then turn it to this dial, and we'll communicate with all of you about
It'll
what's
be
going
totally
on.
fine. Just wait. That's the next startup idea. Is like we're going to bring ham radio to the enterprise.
Perfect. Styrofoam cups with string. Just pick up this end, call the operator. We'll connect you.
Yeah.
But seriously, let's go to that the scale piece. But I think what's interesting about that, there's a couple things you were talking about there. Like we're all operating at higher levels of abstraction.
Yep.
But at some point, something breaks. And then the question is, who in this building understands what's beneath the surface of this thing, so we can actually go investigate it, right?
Yeah.
And if you talk about delivering software effectively, often building for overscale, like well beyond what you're actually building for, is introducing a lot of either complexity or tooling or dependencies that you have to understand now, but you didn't actually need.
Yeah.
So you're adding weight to your delivery. Does that make sense?
I think it does. Like I gave, I think it was actually pandemic. I think it was the last talk I actually gave. And I think it was at DevOps Days PDX in Portland. And it was like right before the pandemic started. But I gave this talk and it was on the dark side of scale because I was personally wrestling with this. Because again, as I mentioned at the top of the podcast, like you get to see some of your decisions play out over time. And I'm like, honestly, if I look back, there are definitely cases where like, why did we over-engineer this? Could we have determined earlier on that it was over-engineered, right? Is that even a reasonable thing to say someone could have predicted? What could have played out differently? But in the research for that talk, I kept finding and thinking about examples, and I found this awesome quote, and I believe it was from Kernighan. And he had this quote, and I'll probably butcher it because I don't have it in front of me. But he was like, in order to debug something that you've written, you need to be about twice as clever to debug it as you were when you wrote it. So if you use all of your cleverness when you write something, how can you ever be expected to debug it? And that was like so beautiful when I read that. And I started thinking about this idea abstractly of like a cleverness budget. In how I think about systems, where it's like, is this really the place where I want to spend the cleverness budget? Or should we keep some of it in reserve? Maybe I should just lop a whole bunch off the top and keep it in reserve so I could deploy it when necessary. But it's been fascinating because I'll talk to all these other smaller startups or stuff or advising them. And a lot of the questions I get right out the gate is like, how do we design this for like maximum scale? How do I design this for like 100x of where I'm at for like millions of users? And I'm like, well, why don't you start with getting to like 10 users or 100 users? And turns out you might not need the Death Star that you're looking to build in order to support it, because that's expensive, it's complicated. And how much of that do you really need? And I don't know, it put me down this path where I started looking at like, if I rent, what's the most powerful single server I could rent off of a cloud? And like, how many requests per second could that thing do? And obviously this is fatuous, like for DR and a bunch of other stuff, you don't want one, but I'm not convinced people fully appreciate how fast stuff is and can be, even when it's small. Yeah. And they might be surprised like how far you can get with not that much stuff, right? And at the point you need it, hopefully it's a good problem, right? Like,
well, yeah, and well, the interesting thing about that, I was thinking about a case in my own world from startup days in a different company, but often that biggest machine is going to be twice as big by the time you run into that problem, right? Like, sometimes someone else will stay ahead of your problem for you. Like we were, I was building a marketplace, and it was a social marketplace, and we basically had as much of the Facebook graph as we needed in memory on one box.
Oh, yeah.
And every time we got close to the limit, like we spent a lot of time writing the software to get it that tight, but every time we got close to the limit, AWS launched a bigger box. And we're like, okay, we don't, and everyone's saying, when is this thing going to be horizontally scalable? I was like, when it needs to be. Like right now, I got other problems to solve, right?
Exactly.
And so, if in that case, if you could sort of stand on the shoulders of these giants or whatever, let other people do all that work.
Yeah.
Again, one box is not the best answer for everybody, but if you're just trying to figure out if you're solving an interesting problem, then scoping that down as much as possible and saying, this is fine, right? And it's simple and we all understand it, so we can pivot easily.
Yeah.
oh, now we have a business and the business is scaling and I can worry about what are my, scaling trajectory and can I map to that?
Part of me thinks like, there's that saying which was like, no one ever got fired for buying IBM or something like that. It's that old canard around like, if you go with an established thing that's on trend, like no one is going to look ill upon you for doing it. And I think about that sort of industrially, in other people that are like us, we're the stewards of how we build these systems. And it's like, does anybody really ever get fired for over engineering or designing for excess scale? And I'm not convinced that they do. But if someone undersized something and then it starts to creak once you get to like a zillion users or whatever it is, like that's as much a source of like, ire or ridicule or something. Like, why didn't you think about it? If I take a step back, I'm like, actually, I think maybe it's that second person, that maybe was onto something. And the first, and I think this shows up in how we hire people as an example. Like, like let's say there's two different people, and they show up and, it's for like a infrastructure, it's like an ops gig and I have, or a software dev. And I have the one person and she has a ton of experience and her CV says like, oh, I built this thing, processes billions of dollars. I built this system that does like all kinds of, super duper scale, like 100x of where I need it to be. And then the second person, let's say she has on her CV like, yep, I slimmed down and simplified, this product that I was working on. I reduced how many servers it ran on from 100 to 10. My gut feel, and I'll be upfront, and my initial reaction when I made this thought experiment for myself is I'm like, where's my bias? Which one would I, and I'm like, I totally would go for the first one, I think, where I'd be like, oh, that's super impressive. Look at all the stuff that you've done. And then I'm like, wait a minute, what is wrong with the other one? Because actually, most of the problems I feel like I kind of run into, it's not that scaling is an easy problem, but I feel like there's more of a playbook on like what to do. I feel comfortable engaging with that problem because if I'm not meeting a certain level of scale, like what do we do to get to the next level? And I think we all kind of understand that. But what I've lost is like, if I don't have anyone I'm bringing on with a devotion to simplicity and simplification, it probably won't happen. And if I only have people working on my staff that are just like max scale, max scale, max scale, should I really be surprised as the technology leader that I end up in a place where my teams overcomplicate a lot of stuff? Right. And I'm like, I think I have only myself to blame, right, about it. But it's interesting because it makes me think like, what made me this way? Right. Like why do, and I've asked this question to a lot of other peers and a lot of them have the same answers as me to this thought experiment. And I'm like, how did we get here? Like, where did we get to this place where we value that? But simplicity is viewed as like, oh, that's not good enough. Right. Like, I don't know.
Well, so one answer that comes to mind immediately, and I totally agree with you, is we know how to put numbers on performance and scale. We don't really know how to put numbers on simplicity. Right? Like there's plenty of work in the canon. I love the expression canon because I spent a lot of time in Star Wars. But anyway, I have kids. It's where you end up. So
pretty much.
But there's plenty.
I'm waiting for the anime version of this podcast, by the way, that'll show up on Disney Plus. I'm here for it.
I'll see what I can do. I just don't have that many connections over there. Maybe I need to invite some other people to this podcast, and then we'll make it happen.
There you go.
But there's plenty of work out there on simplicity, right? There's plenty of thinking.
Yeah.
But and we all talk about it daily in a way like, wow, this feels overcomplicated. This feels overly complex, whatever. But making the case for how that's going to shift in our systems is a lot harder than just saying, oh, we can handle twice as many requests per second over here or whatever, right? And so. Yeah. So I do think, though, it's such a foundational element. Like, and I guess one of the ways I was thinking about that is like we get presented with a class of problems, and the most natural instinct is to try to solve the class of problems, not to say, why do we have this class of problems? Like, can we make the class of problems go away so that we can have a simpler, just day to day, we can focus on other things, right?
Yep.
And I think we all dream a little bit of having scaling challenges. Like that's exciting,
yeah.
right? That's like the exciting part of the job is it's a sign that we're succeeding maybe.
Yeah, you get people often compare companies based on like how many users, what's the scale, and people often brag about like, I've done stuff with this many servers and whatever, this kind of infrastructure. And yeah, I've done it too. but I think there's a certain fashion maybe around being big, and I think it's not bad in and of itself, but it can be bad when put in relation to other choices that you have on how to do stuff. Like, especially more recently, as I started to build out newer products inside of the company, I've kind of learned this lesson, right? Where I'm like, okay, what is the absolute minimum amount of stuff required in order to get this out there and put it in front of some people to see how the market reacts? And then, yes, you have to make a trade-off, which is, well, what if like 10,000 people all of a sudden want to sign up at the exact same time? Can the system handle it? Maybe not. Well, isn't that terrible? And it's like, I don't know. That sounds like a pretty good problem to have if 10,000 people are trying to log into a thing. I mean, Twitter had the famous fail whale for how many years, and then they're a thing. It turns out they're pretty popular. That did not sink them.
I think product market fit, right? Which is what, you're sort of, you talk about trying to act like a startup a little bit inside of a larger company. There's probably a whole bunch of dynamics that go on there. Like our customers and our brand mean that this runs at enterprise scale, but you're talking about something that doesn't. There's, obviously there's a lot to balance there, but without product market fit, you just don't have that problem. And if you have product market fit and people are like, wow, this is totally innovative and blows my mind and I want more of it, they'll probably say, sure, we understand that it's early and we'll work through the kinks with you. So you have a window. I would imagine, and I don't know if you think about this, part of that is like, I know this is going to break, but I've worked on these kinds of systems long enough that I know exactly where it's going to break. And I know how to apply those skills when it breaks. I'm just not doing that right now.
I think that's a really good point. It's like, I wouldn't be advocating for like taking a cavalier approach to architecting a system. But I mean, if you've built enough stuff, you can start to identify, if this part of the architecture gets saturated, we kind of know what to do. That's not hand waving and saying it's going to be a gimme or it'll take a day to fix that up. But like, it's not a rocket science thing, so I think there's a certain amount of work you can do to take a problem from, we literally have no idea how we would even approach solving it, to we think we kind of know, we're not going to do anything about it just yet, but we kind of know we can characterize the risk. And you know what? We're cool with accepting that certain level of risk in exchange for, we can move way more quickly. This thing is way more like stripped down and simpler to fit in our brains. And I was talking to one customer, and I was asking them to walk me through like sort of the incident response or like the debugging process of their app. But it's like a cloud native team, and they describe like, okay, something breaks, like it's intrinsically it's like a day-long process to figure out like what is broken. And they're like, we want to get the logs, but of course everything's like containerized and running everywhere. So like, there's no system you could log in to just get logs from something. You have to go to your like distributed tracing, collection point or your log aggregation service. And then that thing is its own behemoth that you also ironically have to deploy and maintain. Right. And then it just keeps going. Right. Where they're like, by the time you isolate what system is affected, maybe that pod has been recycled. Maybe that container has disappeared. Maybe those connections have been terminated. And the person I was talking to was just like, sometimes I think back to if this was just running on a server and I could just like look at it and like I could trace, I could just literally attach a debugger to a thing and then see what's going on. And he's like, so sometimes it makes me wonder. And then there's coordination overhead. Maybe it's a separate team that manages the log aggregation or the Prometheus stuff or whatever. And every layer that we add, like, I don't know, I think I've started to ask way more often, like, is it worth it? And not an abstract, but like, is it worth it now? Like, is it really the thing that's going to move the needle for you, like in the next 3 months? And if the answer is no, then I'm not saying don't do it ever, but maybe now is not, maybe you haven't earned the right to scale to that level. Maybe that's a way of putting it, which is, I don't know that people necessarily engage with like, have is the work I'm doing, have I earned the right to think about this higher scale problem yet? And I think in like, what's the stat about how many startups like don't ever make it past, a year or two? Probably a lot.
Well, I mean, you can just use VC portfolio numbers, right? They're expecting 1 in 10 basically to actually make them any money.
So I'm like, okay, so out of the 10 people that are listening to this, that are working at a startup, that are wrestling with this problem, like maybe it's the wrong maybe scale is the wrong benchmark. And instead it should be like, no, seriously, there's a 90% likelihood that, this won't last. So what do I need to do to sort of stay in the game and on the dance floor for a certain amount of time? And how much of that is best served by like building a bunch of stuff out. And then we see the consequence of some of this, I think, manifest in like in larger enterprises that sort of, in a weird way, they absorb the fashion, but kind of skip over the like, let me figure out what it really takes to get this stuff working. And they go straight to like, we've got the architecture that checks all the boxes. And now they suffer from stuff like your attack surface is 20 times as large and complicated as it was before, in exchange for what you could theoretically scale out a little bit more. Maybe that's valuable to you. Maybe that's not. I mean, but there's definitely a cost. And, I think maybe that's another way of framing it that I hadn't thought about, which is like, there's a cost to scale, not just a monetary one. And, I don't know to what extent we roll that in when we think about like a cost benefit analysis, or we do trade-offs, around that.
Well, one thing I took out of all of that is simplicity always wins, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's your attack surface, whether it's your ability to figure out how to scale or what to scale, whether it's your ability when you're one of those 9 startups whose current business model is not actually going to work out to pivot and find one that will.
Yeah.
If you've cemented the structure of your application across 15 microservices and a Kubernetes deployment, best of luck as you pivot. Like you're going to have a lot of, speaking of getting on the other side of the time horizon of your decision, you're like, oops.
Yeah, for sure.
I wish I could get that one back, right?
Like,
and so,
if there was one thing I would want to communicate to listeners, like if you take nothing from this conversation, other than how many Scrabble points my last name is worth, and this, I think there is no simpler like server or service to debug than one that doesn't exist, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's the easiest thing to monitor. It's the easiest thing to debug. It's the cheapest thing you could ever do. Just it doesn't exist. So I think it's a super powerful statement you're making, which is like simplicity it's just super undervalued, and it's expensive in brain power, I think, to get there. But like the rewards are so high, I'm like, that's my plea to the industry.
well, I mean, speaking of sort of your growth as a leader and your transition, I mean, reflecting on my own sort of past decisions and whatever, I mean, I would say that areas where we have complexity in our system, a lot of that is because I'm the one that can see at a higher level and didn't go sort of help people focus on like create the space. Hey, you know what? It's important for us to be simple here. Or these choices are being made independently and you're not seeing the impacts on each other, that like this is increasing our overall system complexity. So is there any, as you look back and catalog 10 years, is there anything that sort of pops out where you feel like you could have given more opportunity or like helped people see that better?
Yeah, I think there was definitely a period where I think I did not fully appreciate how powerful it is to say no to stuff. I think. And it's hard. Like it's actually super hard. I mean, it's hard for me, at least. I'm sure there's some people out there that are just like, I could say no to people all day. But I think
they have different problems. It's okay.
Yeah, that's true. But it's like, I almost think that depending on what stage you're at with managing a product or an engineering team, like at a certain point, a lot of people experience like any option on the table is probably valid and rational. Right? Like, should we break this out into a separate service? Like, yeah, okay, that's rational. That's not a crazy thing to say. Should we focus our attention on making this meet like 100x the scale of users that we currently have? Yeah, that's pretty rational. Should we make it faster? That's rational. Should we build these new features to open up a new market? Like, that's rational. So I think, it's easy to fall into this place where you're like, well, they all seem pretty good. Maybe we should just greenlight kind of all of it because they all have supporting rationale if we have the bandwidth to engage with all of those problems.
Yeah.
Whereas I think if I was more just brutal about like, okay, if I could pick one, the one thing out of all of them that would actually move the needle, which one would it be? We're all focused on that because I think it's hard to contextualize some of these technical decisions. I think unless you really, I mean, my background's as a techie, so I've actually in my career, I've had to learn in a lot of ways to engage more with the business side of the house, right? And the product management side of the house. Like they didn't teach me that when I'm getting my computer science degree, right? Like they never talk about that. It's all about algorithms, performance, and, code practices. So naturally, that's the place I think a lot of technology leaders, you go with what you know, right? So it's like, yep, I know the playbook on how to solve this technical problem, like build this thing out. Or you have a picture in your head of how this should look. So you mobilize people to get that picture realized. But it's expensive, and at our level, I think like at an executive level, the leverage you have when you tell people what to do, like you can be mobilizing hundreds of people. Yeah. So the consequences are really high. And I think I've had to really learn to use the business as the appropriate backdrop for, I mean, this probably sounds like real basic to everybody listening, but it was a struggle for me and the struggle is real. So I can't be the only one, right? But viewed through that business lens, I probably would be like, yeah, why didn't we spend more time? Like maybe we shouldn't have re-architected this thing, maybe we should have kept it on the same tech stack that it was because users were familiar with it. Maybe the thing that the business values is consistency and reliability of the product and the user experience, as opposed to, hey, we've replumbed, all this stuff, but the user gets the same feature set that they had before, which as a techie makes all of us happy because we get to refactor and do cool new techie stuff. Right. But like, what's the motivation behind it? So I think there's a lot of examples I can think of stuff like that, where probably if I could put all of the worst mistakes in a single bucket, it would be over rotating on the purely technical aspect of why this is a good idea or a bad idea, divorced from a larger business context that would have probably made the decision way more simple for me to just deal with and mobilize people and rally them around. Right. But, so I don't know if that's the same characterization, like looking back in, your career of, if that falls in the similar way, but
yeah, well, I would say absolutely not just making decisions around business context, but helping others see business context to then go make decisions. Right. Which is as you grow, I think one of the interesting pieces that you probably also went through is there is a scale where actually you're just someone else in the trenches, in the engine room, whatever analogy you want to use, just cranking stuff out. Yep. And then suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, look at all these people. Like who's leading them, right? Yeah. And so kind of always being a step behind.
It's that Spider-Man meme where it's like you're actually pointing at yourself and you're like, oh, I'm the leader.
Right. And so, figuring out, wait a second, not only am I overdue to be operating at a different level, but now I'm just seeing it and I have a whole bunch of learning to do to go execute at that level. And to your point, I don't know how to do this. I'll fall back on the things I know, right? Which is like, hey, let me help you write that code. Like no one needs help writing code. Totally. I got a lot of really smart people around me, right? And so, but what do I get to see? I mean, the thing that I'm sure you see the same thing and realize every day is I'm sitting in conversations that a lot of people are not sitting in, right? I'm looking at a much longer time horizon, and I'd love to get back to kind of like your time horizon now, because you're thinking about, what's next. And so how do I bring that perspective and help people see it so they can have that extra information to make good decisions? Because they know way more about what's closer to the customer.
Yeah. There's definitely, I've grown to appreciate the value or the role that I think like a CTO plays in giving clarity to the rest of the technical organization, right? And it's not necessarily just about like, there's a bunch of different flavors of CTO. I don't know that it's a well-defined like executive role, it's a pretty big like spectrum, but I don't view it as necessarily like you're the peak scientist or like you're the peak architect for a thing. I mean, that's part of it, right? Like, I think that helps, but I think honestly, a lot of it is just like giving clarity and context around the problem so that you ideally don't have to be the one solving it. Because if you have to be the one that solves it, like back to scale, I mean, how well does that actually scale? And presumably you're hiring other people for a reason, and you want to give them the autonomy to engage with some of these problems. So in that, viewed through that lens, it's like, it's less about what are my opinions about like architecture. And it's more like, can I provide folks the right amount of clarity around the problem we're trying to solve? Like, this is important. This we don't have to worry about. This we don't have to worry about. This we have to nail it. Nothing else matters. Like, that's probably not going to come from a lot of other places inside the company. So, it's that megaphone is super powerful, I think.
Yeah, I would really agree. And I think that, as I make these jokes all the time, like there's a T in my title, but I'm not really sure. Like, I don't know, maybe it's like chief team officer or something.
Chief team officer.
It's definitely not technology. It's got something to do with people, right? Because at the end of the day, all leadership roles are people.
Yep.
Like you're trying to figure out how to give the space for people to be more effective, however you want to think about it.
Yep.
And I wonder in the end if the technical part is just the ability to speak that language, right? To contextualize, like, look, I have so much exposure to the business, but let me help you kind of frame that in a technical way, right? Not because you don't understand the business at all, but because I understand a little bit of what you're saying, and I understand a little bit of what our customers are saying and what our product team is saying, et cetera, right?
Yeah, no, I think you're totally dead on with it. And I think now that I spend more of my time kind of managing more of a BU, like a business unit that's tasked with, we're building out and we've launched new product and stuff like that. Like, it's a good proving grounds for a lot of the stuff that I think we've been talking about. Because in a weird way, I think the bigger a company is, the more opportunities you have to, I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but like your decisions have places to hide, And I think when you strip a lot of that away and you really get back to like, look, okay, it's a smaller team of folks. We want this to be more cross-functional. We have a super clear mandate. Like, let's start building some stuff and see how that actually plays out in the market. It's an opportunity for you to really test some of this stuff. Like, for example, it's more important than ever in that environment to be super convicted about like, this is what's important from a business context. And this just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter yet. It doesn't matter yet. It doesn't matter yet. Because in those situations, like, time is of the essence. Like, getting into market is super important, and risk is really high, and the market is unpredictable. Like, you don't know what the hell people are going to think about whatever you build until you put it out there and they actually use it. So, it really forces you, I think, to start getting back to sort of the basics of technical leadership. And I don't view it as a step down. If anything, I've kind of come around to this idea that, like, just growing a company and just managing more and more and more and more and more people in a technical organization, I don't know that for a lot of people out there, and that feels like the default track, I think, for technology executives. But I actually have become much more interested in like a different framing of it, where it's more, you learn the principles and the methodology and what it takes to kind of manage and mobilize a technology team, and bring it back to basics, I think. Yeah. And in many ways, a lot of larger companies are looking for that, because they almost have the opposite problem, which is, well, we've grown, now we're so big, it's actually really hard for us to innovate. It's hard to do something new, or it's the antibodies kind of come out from a company, right? Yeah. And it's like, what's this new thing? That's not the old thing. Why aren't we focused on that? That's what makes us all the money. And that's when you get into this like time horizon sort of difference, where it's like, look, you're correct, but you're correct on a different time horizon than this other problem, which is usually innovation is concerned with a longer time horizon to let a bet play out. Right. And I think a company needs to have a certain different kind of appetite for that. And they need to understand that some of these bets, you have to let them, new ideas are fragile, right? Like, you have to give them time to grow. It's super easy to be like, I planted this seed 2 days ago and like nothing is sprouted. This is garbage. And then, you just like drop kick it into a dumpster. Like, that's not how you grow stuff. You have to give it the right amount of space and care. So I find myself in this weird dual set of conversations, right? With some companies where they're just like, I'm super small. How do I move more quickly? But also just as much, I find myself in conversations with technology teams where they're like, we are super huge. How do we move quickly? And
well, there's the unifying connector, right? So I think that's, I mean, it's a really good perspective. Like, and when you're small and it's your only offering, you might be more hungry to make it work, right? It's not like, well, it didn't work, let's throw it out and continue not getting paid and dream up other ideas, right? Like, whereas when you have this large infrastructure to rely on,
it's like a safety net.
Yeah, it's probably difficult to cultivate that sort of, that focus and drive. And so as we wind things down here, I'm looking for like a core lesson out of that. Like you started small, you grew to a very large scale, and now you're sort of trying to, I'll say, incubate, for lack of a better word, small inside of that large scale. Is there anything that you would tell, I guess 1 year, I don't know exactly what the time frame is, but like 1 year ago, Deepak, like as you were leading that large organization, are there characteristics of what you do now that you wished you could have brought in at large scale?
I think it would have been act as though you were small, even if you were big. And I do admit, like, it's harder to do that, and it's more of a diplomatic challenge, I think, at a higher level of scale, because there's just way more inertia that you have to overcome. But ultimately, I think about like the companies that at large scale remain super successful. And I think a lot of it is just like they've cracked a certain code for their market around just maintaining a super high level of velocity. And rarely do I see any of those success stories pan out where it's like, yeah, you know what? We just figured out how to just make money, but move super slowly. It's like nobody has that origin story, right? It's all about like, how do we figure out how to get back to, doing things more quickly? So I would say larger scale version of me, and I'll probably take this into, future stuff that I do, which is like, doesn't matter how big the company is. It's like giving people like a ruthless amount of clarity is like super important. Like focusing a lot of attention and energy on like what has to be true, like now, what do we have to nail? Like pretending as though I don't have the bandwidth to execute on 15 different things at once. What if I force myself to only execute on 2 things and nothing else? What would those 2 things be? And even if the ultimate decision involves like rolling it out to a broader team or slow rolling some of those ideas, I think I would still probably be better served, at least upfront, thinking about it in that way, because that's the stuff I think it's so easy to lose if you're not paying attention. It's like I have kids too, and they're, one's 5 and one's 8. And there's that corny saying about how they grow up so fast, and before you know it, they're just at a different stage. And like, I think it's the same thing with companies, right? Engineering teams. Like you look back and it's like, how did we get this big? And what did I not stop and think about? And it's like, sometimes now I talk to my kids and I'm like, they're kids. I should engage with them like kids and have juvenile kid-like fun and watch all the Star Wars anime with them on Disney Plus that I post. I'm not sponsored by Disney Plus, by the way, although I'm totally willing to be sponsored by Disney Plus. So if anyone listening out there wants to, I'll put the logo, I'll get a like face tattoo. It's all good. But I think there's maybe a lesson there in like, if you're working at a place that's small, like live it up. It's awesome. I know it can be scary, but like you learn so much in so little time. It's such a powerful crucible. And then as your teams get bigger, like don't lose that and actually dedicate some energy and time to getting reconnected with that, or advise some smaller companies, work with smaller teams, just build that muscle back up, because chances are you'll need it sooner or later.
Got it. Love it. Always be simple. Keep things simple. Keep things small. Act like
there you go.
Small. Love it. No one loses with those 2 ingredients. That's the takeaway. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining today. Thanks for everyone who's tuning in and listening. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe on your podcast provider of choice, or on YouTube if you're watching, to see the awesome artwork in the background. Deepak, thanks again. This has been awesome. And if you're listening and want to hear us talk about anything else, or to anyone else, hit us up on Twitter at CircleCI. Thanks again.
Thanks so much.